gives you some public visual of this type of racist assumptions, I'll say, from the legacy of eugenics that are still prominent today. Second, I think there's some problems that need to be considered with the power of the discourse of naturalization. If culture or art or architecture evolves just like a snail evolves, this implies a certain inevitability to a process, even if it's natural selection or environmental adaptation. It implies that culture is driven by natural law and it removes responsibility for social outcomes. And again, I'll go back to just kind of these ideas of arguing that nature or design and architecture seem to evolve following the same types of processes. I think this shouldn't be an unconscious metaphor. I think it should be a very carefully thought about metaphor. I think there are problems with biological determinism and scientific absolutism, even with complexity theory. I think the new information theory is kind of becoming the new catch-all absolutist vision for how things occur. And I think it's really important to think about what the importance of that is to the humanities. In particular, Richard Dawkins' theory of memes and mimetic design is brought up again and again by a number of these architects. My visual example of that is that such things as building a bird's nest, which a bird does by instinct or supposedly by some sort of information that's encoded inside of its being, they argue that humans build houses for the exact same reason. Well, as an architectural historian, I can see all kinds of reasons why buildings look different ways at different times and serve different functions, so I think that's a way oversimplification that dismisses the importance of analyzing why we choose certain styles and how we justify them at certain times. I think there's a new rhetoric of colonialism, but instead of invading, say, the Western Hemisphere, we're invading DNA, we're invading nature. And there's globalization in terms of kind of economic interests behind this. And actually, a number of these architects dismiss critical theory. For those people who are in the humanities, that's one of the main tools for dismantling colonialism. So I think it's really important to look at this nexus of how this is working. And just one very simple example. This is, again, the Genetic Architectures book coming out of Barcelona. Alberto Estevez, who was the director of this program, this quote that he had in his book was phenomenal. He says this. He describes genetic architecture as a colonial mission. Quote, "Who will be the new Christopher Columbus? The only remaining thing is to find the corresponding Queen Isabella," and I would say, or Sheikh Zayed, "to concede their personal jewels for such an enterprise." In other words, we just want to fund her, we're going to go out and find the new world. Great metaphor, but there's a lot of problems historically with Christopher Columbus and Queen Isabella and what happened in the New World. So I just want to raise this colonial impetus as something to be thought about. And I think it's important to learn from historical mistakes. I will not say that we're doing eugenics all over again, but I will be looking for it. If it's there, I'm going to try to point it out. And I just put this up. It's kind of a recent discussion that's growing right now about eugenics. In Oregon, the state's eugenic records were shredded. They were just discovered to be completely missing. Clearly, there's a problem with this history. At least somebody thought that. Here, a number of governors have begun apologizing for forcing sterilization on people in state asylums and on criminals. And so with that comes usually monetary remuneration. It raises all kinds of legal issues, but yet this is still an ongoing history. It's alive today. And in fact, the last sterilization law came off the books in 1983, so it was not very long ago. Over 70,000 people in the US were sterilized against their will. And the very last thing I want to end with is maybe a positive thought, which is I think that it's also really, really exciting what's happening in terms of self-organization, emergence, this idea of beginning to understand the way that complex systems work. It's phenomenal. And nature is an incredible model for sustainability. So even though I kind of question the little victimless leather coat as a model for sustainability with consumer goals of design, I think there actually is a pretty compelling argument to be made. And I need to kind of sort through the different sides of how that argument plays out. But to be able to understand the way that nature derives from information to create these incredible structures that are, again, they're beautiful, they're mobile, they're efficient in terms of structure and function. They're differentiated to different needs. They can follow the sun. It's phenomenal. And if we could create buildings that have many of these qualities and do it with that kind of grace and efficiency, one of the books I have up here is a book on elegance as a new kind of architectural motif. I think there's a strong allure and a strong reason for that. So I'm going to be looking at the pros and cons of this whole kind of phenomenon as I move forward. All right, I'm done. So now we get to see guys who are actually doing this, like in a different way. So I'm very excited to look at history and then look at actual implementation in your field.
So let's take a few minutes to
answer
a few questions while
okay.
you guys get set up. And questions? Observations? How do you relate this to social Darwinism?
Well, historically, I think there are aspects of social Darwinism with regards to eugenic ideas.
Preceded eugenics, social Darwinism.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But the idea that there are kind of, fit individuals or unfit individuals, and you should let the environment do what it is. I will say personally, I really dislike competition and survival of the fittest as a model for human society. I think it doesn't work, even though I think it undergirds capitalism, it undergirds militarism, it undergirds so much of what we live in. So, I think there are issues from that idea of social Darwinism that absolutely carried forward into eugenics. And I think that eugenics of the 1940s, if you look at some of the people making particular arguments in the 1980s and 1990s, there are social Darwinists still today who would argue that that's the most productive, economically viable route for dealing with social policy. And I find that really problematic.
So one of the things, Christina, that I was really fascinated reading the book, thank you for the book, is just bringing my awareness back to the timing of all this. The Darwinism was fairly new, the Industrial Revolution, all that was happening very quickly. And there were a lot of new ideas on the block. And I feel like we're at a similar time in information theory and other things at this point in history where a lot is happening very quickly. And there's lots of new ideas, and as you pointed out, scientific ideology is being held up and being spread around pop culture. And that interplay is very interesting. I'm really glad to see that there are people in humanities looking at this, because I think people in the sciences won't naturally look at this. We're a bit myopic about the context we're in.
Well, thank you. And I think it's also really interesting that from a scientific perspective, you can actually look at nature, you can use a scientific method, and you can understand new truths about the way things work. But this idea of truth, when you translate it, it becomes this broader level, it begins to have other types of problems associated with it. And the whole idea of relativity and the truth change and the power of ideology, I think you have to look at the bigger picture, not just within the scientific picture. And nature and culture, and where those two things go together.
The political and consumer or corporate influence of that era, of the industry, they needed efficiencies, they were seeking efficiencies, they found new efficiencies and wanted to keep them going. And I think we're under the same forces today. And so I think it's really good that you're doing this research, and I look forward to you staying connected with us and helping us look harder at these questions.
Yeah. So, do you see the genetic manipulation of reproduction as the main way that eugenics is being expressed now and in the future? And do you think that eugenics is something that's always going to be it's going to sort of pop up in society in different ways in the future?
Well, I don't know. I feel like, yes, it would be through genetics, because that's what I think eugenics is. The goal focuses on genetic manipulation, right? Just by nature of what eugenics, the term is. And I think it's also tied to the EU part, which is this goal of improvement or betterment. So just because you're using genetic engineering to solve certain problems, to me, that's not necessarily eugenics. There's certain ways, I think, in context in which it becomes more about pure on improvement, in terms of species improvement or social improvement, that, I feel fairly sensitive from having studied the historical literature, that there are arguments and goals and values that surface pretty repeatedly in eugenics that will be kind of markers for me of belief systems that are tending in that direction. But I'm not saying that what's happening right now is eugenics. Again, what I'm saying is I do think, like Greg Stock in his book, he denies that eugenics was ever part of the U.S., really, and he denies that what's going on is eugenics now, in terms of genetic engineering. But yet he puts that on the cover of his book and talks about the long-term blue light. To me, that's a problem and needs to be examined. So all I'm saying is if eugenics is prevalent, and I see some of the rhetoric of eugenics in the architects' lingo about having genetic algorithms that are, you set the parameters to achieve certain types of fitness functions. That may mean something completely different than what it meant to breeders back in the 1930s, but it's a very parallel rhetoric. So I'm just sensitive to it, and I'll be learning more and trying to analyze it. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm really interested in the idea of just what is progress in general, and wonder if you have any ideas about alternatives to our kind of, radical following that, more is better and capitalism and all of that. Like, is there an alternative?
Well, plenty of people in Santa Fe and around the world think there are alternatives. And especially, I think it's really interesting in sustainability discourse that in general, if you look at kind of the history of organic design or sustainability or green architecture, in architecture journals, it's been split